Let's go back to the idea of insight. Now, as we were saying, there seem to be two different classes of problems. Non-insight problems, so these are problems where you sort of typically consciously try to make your way through from the beginning to the end, and insight problems, which are problems in which usually you just feel stuck until suddenly you're like, oh yes, she's a minister, right? And you get the solution that way. But are these truly different types of problems? And Metcalf and Wiebe addressed this exact question. So they gave participants two problems. One was an insight type problem. So it might sound something like a prisoner was attempting to escape from a tower. He found a rope that was almost long enough to escape. He divided the rope in half and cut it, and finally arrived and managed to escape. How did he do? So this kind of sort of ill-structured problem where in order to get to the solution, you need to somehow restructure the problem in order to see how it could be solved. And then the second type of problem was a non-insight problem. So something more algorithmic, more routine-based, more non-productive. And this, in this particular experiment, the non-insight problem was typically some kind of algebraic problem, just as the one that you see here. And then, and this is the interesting part, what they did is they asked participants every 15 seconds, what is often referred to as a warmth feeling. How close did you feel on a scale from 1 to 7 to the solution? 1 being very far away from the solution, 7 being got it. And so these are the average ratings of warmth from the participants. So let's start with the non-insight problem, so the algebraic problem on the right side. And I'll start by orienting you to what these graphs mean. So at 60 seconds before, so take the moment when when finally the solution, they get the solution. That's what happens up here. Now go back 60 seconds before they get to the solution, and see how were participants scoring, how close they were, how warm they were. And if you look at it overall, the mode is 2, meaning most participants felt that they were not very close to the solution. Some really, really far away, some middle, a few felt very close to the solution. Then you wait 15 seconds. And now if you look at it, the mode has shifted from 2 to 3 and 4. Meaning that participants feel a little bit closer to the solution. Then another 15 seconds go by. And now looks like some people went back, but there's also a large number of people that feel yet even closer to the solution. And finally, 15 seconds from solving it, you can see that most participants feel very close to the solution. And finally, they solved it. So this really portrays non-insight problems as this slow, very conscious, very clear process of going from an initial state, the problem the way it's stated, to the final state or the solution. Now let's look at what happens with insight problems. So same thing, but on the left side. So this is when the problem is solved. We're going to start 60 seconds from the problem being solved. 60 seconds, most people are saying no clue. 45 seconds, mode still being no clue. 30 seconds, most people are still between no clue and maybe a little bit of a clue. 15 seconds from solving, still kind of no clue. Solution, I got it. Right. So this is how phenomenally or phenomenologically these problems feel. Non-insight problems, participants are very good at predicting with good accuracy how close they are to solving the problem. And it makes sense. These problems are typically tend to be a conscious accumulation of steps from the initial state to the end state. On the other hand, insight problems don't work this way. Insight problems, you're just standing there, staring at a problem, having no idea how to go by solving it, And then out of nowhere, completely unconsciously, somehow the solution just occurs to you. And that's just it. There's no subjective sense in which you feel you're getting closer. So these data really suggest that the two problems are indeed completely different classes of problems. And they rely on very different cognitive processes. Now, um, on top of this, it also is the case that people really have very little awareness of what is it that led them to have the insight in order to solve the problem. So people are not very good at understanding what are the steps that they took. What is it that led them to somehow reconstruct the problem and find a solution? So Mayer was interested in this exact aspect and took the two-string problem, which we saw earlier, the one where you have to, the final state is to get to hold with your two hands the strings, but as you'll remember, the two strings are too short for you if you're holding one, for you to grab also the other one. So you have to find a way to somehow get the second string also. And you'll remember that the solution to this was to take one of the tools. In fact, in the original problem, there just was, I think, a hammer. Take one of the tools, attach it to the string, and then swing it. And then when it swings sort of towards you, just grab it. Now, the interesting aspect of this is that Mayer was interested in trying to see how providing cues would be processed by the participants. So when Mayer did this experiment, just about 40% of the participants could solve this with no need for hints. However, another 38% of participants only solved the problem after receiving some hint. In other words, some participants just spontaneously appear to be able to restructure the problem and have insight and understand how to solve it. But another 38% needed some kind of cue in order to realize what is the restructuring that is needed to solve the problem. For example, in this particular context, what would happen is that while the first cue is that while participants would be standing there looking at the problem and trying to solve it, the experimenter would walk in, and as they would walk in, one of the strings would sort of, maybe go on them, and as they move away, that would cause the string to start swinging, and for a number of people, that was enough to realize that you could swing the rope just like a pendulum, and use that in order to grab both ends, both ropes. Some participants still needed a little bigger hint. In fact, they needed to be given the hammer and said, this is important for solving the problem. And at that point, they could solve the problem. Finally, of course, there was a subset of participants, on the other hand, who apparently, despite the hints, just never quite restructured the problem and never experienced insight. Now, what was interesting about this is that when participants were asked how they solved the problem, how did you get, what is it that led you to get that aha, I got it, here's the solution moment, most participants were entirely unaware of it. Further, for the participants who received the cues, very few of them ever reported that the experimenter had swung the rope, and that was a hint that led them to experience insight. In fact, some of them would come up with sort of elaborate stories as to how they got to the solution, but it had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with the cues that were provided. In fact, Mayer even offered additional cues, but that were uninformative. So there were sort of additional things that might have been construed as cues, but that in fact didn't help solve the problem. Turns out when participants after were asked how did they get to the solution? They would report using these unhelpful cues just as often as using the helpful cues. So the fact that sort of they saw the rope swing after it was brushed by one of the experimenters. So this really suggests overall that there is just a complete lack of consciousness regarding the nature of insight. So it just seems to be something that happens completely outside of our domain of consciousness. Now, Laura Novick and Sherman were particularly interested in how exactly do we get to have insight. And to do this, they used a very clever task, an anagram task. Now, this particular study was divided in two parts. First, they do show that typically where participants are solving anagrams, it does feel as an insight task, meaning participants will just be staring at the anagram and then all of a sudden, boom, the solution appears to you. So the first experiment, among other things, really proved that the anagram task is an insight type problem, and the participants report having insight out of nowhere. Now, here's the clever twist in this experiment. In a second part to this experiment, they showed anagrams, and half the anagrams would actually make a real English word. Half the anagrams would not. So half the anagrams were sort of pseudo words, as we call them, kind of look like English words, but don't make any real word. And what Novick and Sherman did is they gave participants only a selected amount of time, after which they didn't just have to say if they had a solution or not, but if they didn't have a solution, they just had to report, do you think this anagram makes up an English word or does it not? And if participants were only given 469 milliseconds to solve the anagram, most of the times, participants were not very good at telling whether the anagram could have resulted or would have resulted in an English word or not. What is really interesting is that if you give them a little more time, for 153 milliseconds, and again, participants they didn't get the solution yet. But if you ask them after a little bit more of time, do you think this makes an English word or not? Participants are much better at guessing correctly. In fact, significantly more than chance. And see, because these letter strings were presented for a very, very short amount of time, and participants didn't have enough time to solve it, their answers must have just been based on whatever partial information they had accumulated up to the time they responded. And the interesting fact is that because they respond differently, if you give them a little amount of time or a little longer amount of time, it must mean that some type of problem solving is going on, even if the participants were not aware of it. So from your subjective point of view, nothing is happening, and then all of a sudden, boom, the solution occurs to you. But what this proves is that even though that's how it feels, some information, there is some crunching of the problem that is going on just outside your conscious awareness. And the proof is, in this experiment, that if I give you only a little bit amount of time, you haven't accumulated much evidence about, or much information about, you haven't had enough time to crunch much about the problem. If I give you a little longer time, even though to you it still feels like you have no idea what the answer is, but you have managed to crunch the problem a little more to the point that you're now much better at guessing if it's an English word or not. Meaning, even though to you it feels as if you're just as far away from the answer as before, somewhere inside of you, there has been some processing of this problem that is getting you closer to the solution. So this suggests that much like non-insight problems, although the insight in of itself appears to be sudden, out of nowhere, it also is based on some type of accumulation of information. Except In non-insight problems, this accumulation, this slow working towards the solution is happening very consciously. You're doing step by step an equation, or you're doing step by step the orcs and hobbits problem, or you're solving step by step a chess problem, a chess game. In the insight problems, however, there probably is a very similar process going on where your mind is slowly trying to find out what the solution is. However, it somehow happens under the hood. It happens outside of your domain of awareness. So you're not aware of it, but of course, inside, there's a lot going on. And you might be familiar with the feeling of incubation, where you're working on a problem, you have no idea how to solve it. You drop the problem, you go do something else, and then while you're walking or having a coffee, all of a sudden you go like, oh, I know how to solve that problem, right? This is also known as incubation. This happens. Our mind is, even though not consciously so, is working on the problem and trying to find a solution.